we are going to talk about tonight in Psalm 18 the fact that God is perfect, that He's without blame, without guilt, without error, morally upright, perfectly perfect. I don't know how else to say it. Sounds crazy, but He's perfectly perfect. And nobody, we can't even, I don't think that any of us can even begin to fathom what perfectly perfect is. How God could exist from eternity past all the way to eternity future, and we'll be with Him then. But how God can exist for eons and eons and eons of time and never do anything wrong. It's just a very difficult thing to understand. I can't go for an hour without doing something that's against my God. Even the slightest little frustration or anxiety, I can't go an hour without that. And here God has gone for an eternity, and He's never done anything wrong. He's perfect. His way is blameless. His conduct is perfect, as we'll see when we get all the way down to verse 30. But I want to go through this psalm because we've seen a lot of psalms over the past few weeks that David wrote. And in many of those psalms, David was in life and death situations, pleading with God to save him from somebody. We've seen David's father-in-law, Saul. David wrote at least a couple of psalms in which the topic was, "My father-in-law Saul is out to kill me. Lord, please protect me." We've also seen David's own son, Absalom, who was out to kill his father David, the king. Absalom wanted to kill David and take the throne from David, to be the king of Israel himself. We've read psalms about that. We've read other psalms about Cush, who was a Benjamite, a follower of Saul, who also wanted to kill David. We've seen we haven't seen it, we're not going to go to it, but there's another psalm that David writes where there's a man named Doeg, and Doeg is from Edom. It calls him Doeg the Edomite, and Doeg told Saul where David was hiding. Now, why did he do that? Because he also hated David, Doeg the Edomite, and he let Saul know where David was hiding so Saul could go and kill his son-in-law David. We read another psalm where this group called the Ziphites, where the Ziphites also give away David's hiding place. They go and tell Saul, "Isn't David hiding at Ziklag?" Or "Isn't David hiding in the cave? Isn't David hiding here?" And so they go and tell where David's hiding so Saul can go and find David and kill him. And we've seen many, many psalms where David is in a life and death situation crying out to God. Tonight we're going to switch. Tonight I think what we see in Psalm 18 is David much later in his life. A mature man, a spiritually mature man, a man who's walked with the Lord, a man who's been cleansed of the sin with Bathsheba, the sin with Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, all these things that God rightly punished David for. And I think in Psalm 18 we see an older David because of what we see in the psalm. Psalm 18 is a psalm of gratitude. I've told you there are many, many different kinds of psalms, royal psalms, all imprecatory psalms, different types of psalms. This is a psalm of gratitude. You could kind of call it a royal psalm because the king writes it. It's a royal hymn of thanksgiving is what it is. It's a psalm of gratitude where the warrior king David thanks God because he at last has peace in his life. Nobody's chasing him. Saul has died and has finished chasing David. David's back in the kingdom, back in Jerusalem, back in the palace. The nation is at rest and David is at peace. And so he's thanking God for that in Psalm 18. The warrior king was at last at peace from his enemies, all of his enemies. He lived out the last parts of his days, King David did, in peace in Jerusalem. So I think that's when, based on what is said in this psalm, I think that's when David writes this psalm. The other thing I'll say about this psalm before we dig into it is that this is almost exact word for word what 2 Samuel chapter 22 says. In 2 Samuel chapter 22, David says the same things that he says in Psalm 18. I think probably in Psalm 18, some of the words, because it's not exact, some of the words are changed to make Psalm 18, more fit for public worship. 2 Samuel 22 is very, very personal to David and God, and this one is more fitted for public worship. So look what it says in Psalm 18 in the superscription, the little bitty words before verse 1. This is what it says. This is what David writes. He says that this psalm is for the choir director, so it's a song, just like all the other psalms. So he writes it for the choir director. This is a song that's to be sung in Israel. A psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. It didn't have to happen on the day, but David had enemies for years. Many years of his 40-year reign, David was being chased. But finally here, David sings this song to God. A new song, if you will, because finally Yahweh has lifted his hand of punishment from David and has given David rest and peace in Jerusalem. Look what the psalm says in verse 1. I love you, O Lord, my strength. What a guy. I love you, Yahweh, my strength. The Lord is my rock. Through everything David had gone through, all his life and death situations, David never turned to any God but Yahweh. He never turned to the gods of Canaan. He never turned to Baal. He never turned to anyone else. He was always a worshiper of Yahweh. And after it all, when he is delivered from the hand of all his enemies, when he's back in the kingdom, his first words to God are, I love you. It's a beautiful psalm. The Lord is my rock. We've covered many of these as we've gone over the characteristics of God. David says here, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation. Horn always speaks of strength and power. He's the horn of my salvation. We're not talking about eternity. We're talking about being delivered, saved from the people that wanted to kill him. He's the strength of my salvation. He's the one that saved me all the times I called upon him. He's the strength of my salvation. He's my stronghold. So for 2 verses, David has cried out the greatness and the glory of God. He's speaking of God's characteristic. Who is this God who saved me? He's all these things to me. In verse 3, he says, I call upon Yahweh, who is worthy to be praised. Last week we talked about, or last time we had a session, it was last Sunday, we talked about holiness, God's holiness, and the fact that because he's holy, he is worthy to be praised. He's worthy to get praise from angels. He's worthy to receive praise from men. And that's exactly what David says. I call upon Yahweh and only Yahweh. In all the times I needed to be delivered from a life and death situation, I only called upon Yahweh because he's the only one who's worthy to be praised. And what's the result of calling on Yahweh? I am saved from my enemies. It's a wonderful song of thanksgiving to God. And look at what it's starting in verse 4. We see this poem begin. David starts to write poetry. He ascribes attributes to God that God really doesn't have. He says something about God's ear heard David. God exists as a spirit. He does not look like a man. He exists as a spirit. So does God have a human ear the way David mentions ear? The answer is no. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, does, but God the Father doesn't look like a human being sitting on a throne. He looks like God, and one day we'll be able to answer the question, well, what does that look like? I don't know. We'll know soon enough. But he starts a poem here about God's tremendous appearance on earth on behalf of David. David is speaking about the fact that when I called on God, when he came to deliver me, he shook the world. He shook the whole world. This God who created the earth stirred up the earth with his greatness when he came. So David calls on Yahweh to save him. And look at the lengths that Yahweh went through to save one man, his servant, King David. Look what it says in verse 4. David says, the cords of death encompassed me. It was a life and death situation. He was tangled up with the cords of death, as if to say, I could have died at any moment. I was overwhelmed and overpowered. Any of these people that I mentioned earlier could have killed David if God wouldn't have protected him. The cords of death encompassed me. The torrents of ungodliness terrified me. So ungodly, evil men were coming after David, one after the other. He says it again in verse 5, the cords of Sheol surrounded me, and the snares of death confronted me. And now in verse 6, he says, in my distress, in my life and death situations I found myself in, I called upon Yahweh, the God of my fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one God, the only God. I called upon the Lord, Yahweh, and cried to my God for help. He heard my voice out of his temple. This is talking about heaven. And my cry for help before him came into his ears. So when David cried for help, God heard. And God answered. And because of the anger that David is portraying here, the anger that God has, the anger against David's enemies and God's enemies, it says in verse 7, then the earth shook. It's poetry. David didn't feel an earthquake on that day. But listen to the poetry, the power with which God answered David. David says, when God heard my prayer and decided that he would deliver me, the very earth shook and it quaked. The foundations of the mountains were trembling and were shaken because God was angry. Angry because people had turned against his anointed, the king of Israel. See, there's a time when God punished David. There was a time when David deserved punishment from God, discipline for disobedience. David wasn't always a wonderfully obedient Jew. You remember those times, I'm sure. And so there were times when God needed to punish David, and he did. And he sent people to chase him. He put him in life and death situations. That was all by God's hand. He allowed Absalom, his son, to rise up and kick him out of Jerusalem. That was all by God's hand. What God wanted for David was for him to be the king of Israel, living in obedience to God and be blessed in the palace. But David did things wrong. Give me a name. Give me a couple names. There's some famous names associated with King David when he sinned against God. Give me a couple of those names. What was her name? Bathsheba. What was his name, her husband? What was it, Melba Darlene? Uriah the Hittite. But he was a Hittite. He was Uriah the Hittite. So David takes Bathsheba, a married woman, gets her pregnant, and then to cover up that, he has her husband killed. There was more to the story, but that's the basic of it. So what we have here is David, an adulterer, and in the Old Testament Mosaic law, if you were an adulterer caught in the act of adultery, if you were guilty, what was the penalty? You were stoned to death. If you were a murderer, and David was a murderer, he put Uriah in the line of fire so that Uriah would die without question. In the Old Testament Mosaic law, if you were guilty of murder, what was the penalty? You would be stoned to death. So on two occasions, God showed David mercy. David should have been killed by the Jews twice. God showed him mercy. So God gave punishment to David at different times, but there was a time, and that's why I believe this is later in David's life, and we'll see some of the things that David is about to say about his own walk with God that lead me to believe this must be later in his life. He's grown up, he's matured, he's walking with the Lord, and that's why I prayed that when I started, thank God he's a tomorrow God. He's a forgiver of what is past. And he moves on in this glorious way with King David. Look what he says here. Smoke went out of his nostrils in verse 8. Fire from his mouth, and fire from his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by his anger. He bowed the heavens also and came down with thick darkness under his feet. So David is saying, when I called upon God to deliver me, when God was ready to deliver me, to bless me for obedience, it was a tumultuous event. God shook the earth when he came down to save his king, the man after his own heart. Look what it says in verse 10. Now this is very interesting to me. I'll tell you why after we read it. It says, he's speaking of God himself, he rode upon a cherub. What's a cherub? It's an angel. So what David says in poetry is that God rode upon a cherub and he flew. As if coming from his temple in the third heaven, God came to earth to deliver David personally. It says, and he sped upon the wings of the wind. Now, David knows about the idolatry going on in Israel, and he knows about the chief Canaanite god. What is the chief Canaanite god's name? Starts with a B. Baal, Baal, however you want to pronounce it. You know what Baal was known as, what his nickname was? I say nickname, that's not right. But Baal was known by the Canaanites who worshipped him as the rider of the clouds. What does David say God just did? He sped upon the wings of the wind. So I think deliberately God the Holy Spirit had David write this particular line of poetry to show the people of Canaan that still lived among the Jews, it's Yahweh who's the creator and has the power to ride upon the clouds, not your false god Baal. He just knocked Baal out of the park there. It's God, Yahweh, who is sovereign over all false gods. It's Yahweh who is strong to save. And it's Yahweh, when he answers prayers, does it in a mighty way. And David says, the way he answered my prayer was as if the entire earth shook. Powerful words from King David. There's nothing that can stop Yahweh when he decides to act. That's the point here. Again, this is all poetry, speaking of how God intervened to save David from in this battle situation. We're talking about military battle here. David was up against a foe he couldn't handle. In verse 16, David has painted this huge picture of this storm. The earth is shaking, the foundations of the mountains are quaking. Smoke is coming out of his nostrils. There's fire everywhere. Coals were kindled, etc. This enormous storm. And David goes on. And he says in verse 16, he sent from on high. So God is ready to save David. And this is how David says that God saved him. He says, he sent from on high and he took me. He drew me out of the waters. And again, this is poetry. Now David has shifted to being almost in a shipwreck situation where he's drowning in water. And he would have died from the drowning. Again, poetry, imagery. He's painting a picture. And he says, while it was as if he was drowning in water, God came down and drew him out of the water, plucked him up to save his life from the water. That's what he says here. But we know David's not in water. David's in a military campaign. We'll see that in just a minute. Even right now, look what it says. He starts to say it in verse 17. He delivered me from my strong enemy. He's talking about people, not a drowning situation in water. It's poetry. But the truth is, in verse 17, he says what actually happened is that God delivered me from my strong enemy, from those people who hated me, and they were too mighty for me. He's facing a military enemy that is too great, too powerful, too mighty. They would have overtaken him and killed him had God not intervened. And he's using the imagery of drowning because if Yahweh would not have acted, he would have died just the same way he would die if he was drowning in water. Verse 18, I'm trying to get up to the point where David says God is perfect. all the things that He's allowed in my life, all the things when Saul was chasing me, when Absalom was chasing me, when Doeg the Edomite gave me up, when the Ziphites gave up my position, all the things that God allowed in my life, David says, are perfect. It was perfect when He punished me because I deserved it. It was perfect when I was under the disciplinary hand of God because I deserved it. And God is perfect and makes no mistakes. God does not make mistakes. And that's the beauty of what we're reading here. King David says, I used to have it bad, and God was perfect in the way He dealt with me. And now I have it good, and God is still as perfect as the days when He disciplined me. He's just as perfect today when He treats me and gives me peace and rest in the kingdom. That's the overall picture here. Don't forget who David is and what he's gone through. And in verse 30, we're about to see, he says, God's ways are perfect. Whether He's disciplining me or blessing me. In verse 18, still talking about His enemies, He said, they confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. They came upon me. It was the army that was going to overwhelm me, but God kept me safe. He brought me forth also into a broad place, picked me up from a military campaign and set me into a broad plain where I was safe. He brought me forth into a broad plain. He rescued me. And now David says something that early David could not say, not every day at least. He rescued me because He delighted in me. Why did God discipline David? Because He did not delight in him when he was disobeying God. So this shows a change in David's heart. This shows a change in David's relationship with God. He's not that man that stole a married woman, Bathsheba, anymore. This is a changed man. He's not that man who connived and manipulated this man Uriah the Hittite, who lied with him, tried to trick him into sleeping with his own wife. So David would be off the hook when Bathsheba showed up pregnant. But Uriah was too proud, too good a man. And because his army was in battle, Uriah, the leader of men, would not go in and have the joys and the pleasures of his wife because his army wasn't home. And so Uriah wouldn't do it. And so what did David do? What did David do to Uriah to get him to change his mind and go in and lay with his wife Bathsheba? What? What did he do? What did David do? Another Old Testament Mosaic law sin. He got him drunk. He got him drunk. And he figured a drunk man will lose his honor and instead choose to go lay with his wife. And he would not do it. So what did he do the next night? Got him drunk again. And finally he realized Uriah is too good a man. I can't manipulate this man into doing this. He will not go lay with his wife while his men are living in tents fighting battles. He wouldn't do it. So David sends a runner ahead to the army general and says, put Uriah at the front of the battle and let me know when he's killed. It was a direct order from the general, the commander-in-chief, King David of Israel, to place Uriah in a place where he would most definitely die. David killed Uriah. And this is not that David anymore. Because David is a man who realized the errors of his way, and in his life, he chose to worship and obey the Mosaic law. Look what he says. In verse 20, the end of verse 19 again, God rescued me because He delighted in me. What does that mean? David lets us know in verse 20 and following. Why did Yahweh choose to rescue David? The Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, He has recompensed me or paid me back. Turn to Psalm 51 quickly. Psalm 51, just for a second. Tell me if this is the same guy. Tell me which one came first. Psalm 51. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my sin. Cleanse me from my iniquity. For I acknowledge my transgression, and my sin is always before you. Totally different story, isn't it? He has rewarded me because of my righteousness. In Psalm 51, David is pleading with God as a sinner. For I acknowledge my sin, my transgression, my sin is always before you. Against you, you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak and blameless when you judge. Now you got to have Psalm 51, that idea in your mind. David says that God is blameless when He judges him. When you discipline me, God, you are perfect. It's the same word, tamim. All God's ways are perfect. And David says in Psalm 51, when you judge me because I have done this evil in your sight, when you speak in your holiness, whatever you decide to do to me is perfect. It's right. It's morally upright. It's pure and it's perfect. So this is David coming to God after his sin with Bathsheba. Look what it says in the superscription. Go back up to Psalm 51 to the little bitty words. To the chief musician, a psalm of David when Nathan the prophet went to him when he had gone into Bathsheba. So David is guilty of sin before God, and he's pleading with God to forgive his sins. But whatever God does to him, he knows that God is perfectly just and righteous and holy and all of those things. In Psalm 18, we have a recovered David. Hey, listen, we all go through this Christian life, and some days we have real good seasons. And I can't speak for everyone because I can't. I don't know your lives, but I know that I'm a sinning man. And I know that sometimes I have good seasons and sometimes I sloop down into negative, frustration, whatever. Not anymore, really, not for long. But as a younger Christian, I could get down for weeks at a time, maybe months, and really check out from God, even though I was sitting in the pew every time the door was opened. And David went through periods in his life, in his early life, where he was a dirty, rotten scoundrel. But not in Psalm 18, he's not. Look at what God the Holy Spirit allows David to write about his own conduct before the Lord. The Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands. Not about iniquity, not about transgression, not about sin. All of a sudden, the story has totally changed, and God is giving to David because David is living a righteous, obedient life. I asked the question a minute ago, did God ever punish David? Well, sure He did. He punished David because of his sin with Bathsheba, because of his sin with Uriah, because of other things that David did. I could take you to different thoughts I'm having, but I won't for time. But David has matured and changed in his life. Now let me ask you something, Christian. Are you a different Christian? Are you a different representative of Jesus Christ today? A more pure and holy representative of Jesus Christ than you were the day you got saved? Yes is the answer. I know all of you. Yes is the answer for all of you. And the same is true for David. He came from somewhere. We all have a past. And we all need cleansing, and we all need renewing. We all need to be transformed. And David was no different. Look what it says in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 1 and 2 about King David in the last days of his life. I just want to show you where this great man, a man after God's own heart, who fell hard in life. You can't fall much harder than adultery and murder. Both punishable by stoning to death in the Mosaic Law. You can't go much further. You can't go any further. But he recovered. He was restored. He sought God. He sought reconciliation. He confessed his sin. He pled with God about the sinner that he was. And God forgave him. And in the end of his life, look what it says in 1 Kings 2. As David's time to die drew near, he brings his son to his bed. What does he have to say to Solomon? I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. And you think, well, that's all well and good, but that doesn't say anything about obeying God. Look at the next 2 verses. On his deathbed, these are David's thoughts. Keep the charge of Yahweh your God, not any of the false gods of Canaan, the one true God, Yahweh. Keep the charge of Yahweh your God to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments, his ordinances and his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses. Be a God-obedient man. Obey God. Obey the Mosaic law. Why? Why does he tell these things to Solomon? Because he knows what happens when you don't. Because David also had a past, and David also made horrendous mistakes along the way from time to time. And he says, keep God's commandments and obey the Mosaic law so that you may succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn. Because trust me, son, when you don't keep the law of God, He will punish. And David knew. He ran for his life for years. God knew what he was doing. God knew how he was trying David in those times. He never allowed David to die, but he sure allowed him to run, didn't he? Sure allowed him to hide in cave after cave. That was God doing that to the king. So that the Lord may carry out His promise. Why else does He tell Solomon to keep the law? So that Yahweh may carry out His promise, which He spoke concerning me. And what was the promise that God told David? If, that's a big if your sons are careful of their way to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, no lip service, I want a committed life. Committed to the worship of me and to keeping my laws. If your son will do that, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. How did Israel do? Let me ask you this question. How is Israel doing today? God promised David, if your sons are careful of their way, now this is God speaking. This is a promise. This would have happened if Israel would have obeyed God, if Solomon would have obeyed God, if the sons of Solomon would have obeyed God, but they did not. But the promise that God made to them is, if your sons are careful to walk before me with all their heart and soul, there will never not be a Jewish king on David's throne. It would have never stopped. We would still be living in it. There would have been no church age. There would have been no rejection of Messiah, because Israel would be living in such a close relationship with Yahweh that when Messiah showed up, they would have embraced Him with all their heart and all their soul. He would have died for their sins, been resurrected on the third day, and would have been crowned the King of Israel. He still would have had to go to the cross. Sins had to be paid for. But that's how this would change, and Israel would have never lacked a man on the throne. But Israel does not have a man on the throne of King David right now, because her sons, the kings of David, the sons of David who became kings, were not careful. And they didn't walk before God in truth with all their heart and with all their soul. So God kept His part of the bargain, but Israel did not keep theirs. And the sons of David, most of them, not all of them, there were some wonderful exceptions, but only a handful, literally only 4, maybe 5 kings of Judah that were decent men, God-fearing men. The rest were absolute garbage. Godless idolaters, leading the nation away from Yahweh, from the worship of Yahweh. Allowing the prophet of the Baal to have all his altars and all the Asherah poles and all the wooden idols, and they were just knee-deep in worshiping anything and everything except for Yahweh. But David paints a picture here of this character of the man and this relationship with God in verse 8 or in Psalm 18. He says, God is repaying me, not according to my sins now, but according to my righteousness. Look what he says in verse 21. For I have kept the ways of the Lord. Isn't that what he told his son to do? Why does David have the credibility to tell his son, hold on to God, cling to Him, and keep His commandments? Why does David have the credibility? Because some of us as fathers can tell our kids something, they look at us like, yeah, right. You don't even do that, Dad. Why should I do it? You talk a good game, Dad. You don't walk a good game. But David could talk a good game because in the latter parts of his life, he was walking a good game. Look at what God allowed him to say about himself. If this were not true, it wouldn't be in the Bible. I have kept the ways of Yahweh and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all His ordinances were before me, and I did not put away His statutes from me. I was also blameless with Him, and I kept myself from sin. That's not Psalm 51, David, talking about Bathsheba. This is a new David. Because we can grow from wherever we are. We can grow. We can move forward. We can begin again. Thank God for His grace and His mercy. He's not saying he was perfect the way God is perfect when he uses this word tamim, but according to the law, when David would sin, and I'm sure he did just like we do all the time, at least. I don't know. I'm not going to say how often David sinned. I have no idea. But David, according to the Mosaic law, would have confessed his sin and brought the sacrifice. He's not saying he became perfect. He's saying, I did what God told me to do. And when I fell, I got back up, I confessed, I brought the lamb, the turtle dove, the ram, whatever it was. I got right with God again and I kept walking. Therefore, because that was my lifestyle, the Lord has repaid me, repaid me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in His eyes. When God saw David, He saw him as a righteous man, and that's why David was finally delivered from all his enemies, including his father-in-law, because God deemed him worthy. Rewards. God is a rewarder. Look what he says here concerning God. With the kind you show yourself kind. He's speaking to God about God. With the blameless you show yourself blameless. With the pure you show yourself pure. And with the crooked, the perverse, the evil, and the wicked, with the crooked you show yourself astute. He's a wise God, and evilness and wicked and crookedness will be judged. He's not pushing it aside. He doesn't misunderstand it. He will judge it. But He's astute. He's wise about the way He does it. And He doesn't crush it immediately. He crushes it in His own time. So with the crooked, you show yourself astute. Again, David giving the honor to God of being omniscient and perfect in everything he does. If the wicked still exist on earth, David is going to say that is perfect, because that's exactly what God wants. When God wants the wicked gone, God will destroy the wicked. So if the wicked are still here, then that's perfectly in the plan of God, and David's okay with it. That's what he's saying here. For you save an afflicted people, but haughty eyes you abase. This is an interesting word. I just had to show it to you. What does it mean? Remember haughty eyes in in Proverbs 6, I showed you a list of 7 things that God hates. The very first thing on the list was a haughty look, a proud, arrogant look. And here David uses that phrase, with proud, arrogant people, you abase. You don't lift them up. You don't save them. You abase them. This is the word shafel in the Hebrew, S-H-A-P-H-E-L, shafel, and it means to bring low or to overthrow. It also means to humble someone, conceived of as bringing that person low or bringing that person down. So what does David tell God? In your time, Lord, with all of your omniscient wisdom, when you are ready to deal with the wicked, the crooked, the perverse on this earth, you'll do it. You'll bring them down. You'll overthrow them. However you see fit, you'll do it. And to that, David said, Lord, that's perfect. That's perfect. God rewards people according to their inner character, and only God knows that, and God is always fair. So David knows, to the righteous you'll reward me with rescue, and these wicked who have been chasing me, wanting me dead, when you're ready, you will humble them. You'll destroy. You'll bring them down. In verse 28 he says, for you light my lamp. The Lord my God illumines my darkness. What does the Bible call Jesus when He comes? The light of the world. What does the Bible say in Psalm 119? Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. You light my lamp. You give me direction. You let me know the direction in which I should go. You illuminate my path so I know how to walk. Verse 29, for by you I can run upon a troop. Look at what David is saying. Yahweh has given him this ability to achieve military victories that he never could on his own. By you, Yahweh, by your strength, I can run upon a troop, and by my God, I can leap over a wall. He's talking about his army. He's talking about the men that he leads being able to go over a fortified wall of a city like it's not even there, because God gives the victory to Israel and to David's army. And after speaking, here we have a little bit of a shift. After speaking all these wonderful things that God has done for David, look what David says. What does he conclude about God and his relationship with God? In verse 30, he says, as for God, He's told us about Himself. I was blameless. I was all these things. I kept myself from iniquity. I kept the statutes, the commandments. But what about God? David, you've told us about you. David shifts to God. As for God, His way is perfect. His way is blameless, you may have in your Bible. The word of the Lord is tried. He's a shield to all who take refuge in Him. He's not a shield to all. He's a shield to all who take refuge in Him. And there were times when David did not take refuge in Yahweh. There were times when David lived a sinful life, like Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite. And there were times when David was not protected by God. He was not shielded by God, but God allowed military defeat. God allowed David to be run out of Jerusalem. God punished David, because to whom much is given, much is expected. And God punished David severely for the things that David did wrong. But what does David say of God? He says to God, His way, or he speaks to us of God and says, God's way is blameless. This is the Hebrew word for way. It's the word derek. If you know anybody named Derek, D-E-R-E-K, this is what their word means, what their name means. It means way or road or path. It also means, in context here, a course of conduct. The way you live your life, not only a way like a road or a path, but the way in which you conduct your life, your behavior. And so David says of God that God's course of conduct, whether He's disciplining evil and crooked people the way David himself has been in the past, or whether God is blessing them with peace and rest, if God has chosen it, if God has taken that path, then it's the right path and it is perfect. Look what he says. This word, blameless or perfect, is the Hebrew word tamim. T-A-M-I-M, and it means complete or intact. But it also means free of guilt, So God, when He disciplines David, is absolutely free of guilt. There's nothing God has done wrong. He's not holding back from David something that He's promised to David. He's absolutely free from guilt, and He is not subject to blame. Nothing God does can any created creature ever point the finger at Him and say, "You were wrong about that. You should apologize." It'll never happen. And it'll never happen not because we don't have the ability to point our finger at God. It's because He's never done anything that He can be blamed for. And that's what David says in this psalm. Your way, God, is perfect. Your course of conduct, however you choose to treat humanity at any given time, is absolutely without guilt. It is blameless and perfect. Let's read the rest of it. He says, "For who is God? Where are the other gods? There is no God but Yahweh. For who is God but Yahweh? And who is a rock except our God? The God who girds me with strength and makes my way blameless. Who is there? Is there another God like this? He makes my feet like hinds' feet, like the feet of a gazelle. He makes my feet like hinds' feet and sets me upon high places." Listen to what God does for David. He trains my hands for battle. That's why we know that this deliverance was a battle, a military event. He trains my hands for battle so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have also given me the shield of your salvation and your right hand. This right hand speaks of God's power, His omnipotence. Your right hand upholds me, and your gentleness makes me great. You enlarge my steps under me, and my feet have not slipped. I pursued my enemies and overtook them, and I did not turn back until they were consumed. That has not always been true in David's life. He has not won every military battle he fought. The Philistines haunted David for years. He fought the Philistines for year after year after year after year. But it's true now that God has given him rest. I pursued my enemies and overtook them, and I did not turn back until they were consumed. I shattered them so that they were not able to rise. They fell under my feet. For you have girded me with strength for battle. You have subdued under me those who rose up against me. That was not always the truth, but it is now in David's life. God is rewarding him for a righteously lived life. He's gotten his act together. Thank God for that. I love Psalms I love accounts like this of a guy who didn't do good and then rose up to be this great leader, this great spiritual leader of men. Verse 40 says, you have also made my enemies turn their backs to me, and I destroyed those who hated me. This is very different from the Psalms when David is in the cave pleading with God to save his life while Saul, his father-in-law, is trying to kill him. But now what does he say? I destroyed those who hated me. But not always. Not earlier in his life. Verse 41 says, they cried for help. This is his enemies. He's saying, my enemies cried for help. To whom did they cry? If you don't worship Yahweh and you're crying out to a God for help, who are you crying to? Well, nobody is the actual answer, but they're crying out to false gods. And he says they cried out for help, but there was none to save. They even cried out to Yahweh, but he did not answer them. Then I beat them fine as dust. Let's just read the end of it. I beat them fine as the dust before the wind. I emptied them out as the mire of the streets. More poetry. You have delivered me from the contentions of the people. You have placed me as head of the nations. Is this the David hiding in a cave? Nope. All of a sudden, this is King David of Israel. We're all the highest nations above the highest nation above all the nations. You've placed me as head of the nations, a people whom I have not known serve me. Interesting. Not the kid in the cave. Not the young man in the cave. Not the 20-something and 30-something in the cave. This is an entirely different man. In soul, in relationship with God that has been built. As soon as the nations hear, they obey me. Foreigners submit to me. See how God has lifted up David? It's not the kid in the cave, not the young man. Foreigners fade away and come trembling out of their fortresses. In verse 46 he says, Yahweh lives, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be the God of my salvation. The God who delivered me from all the life and death situations in His life. This God should be exalted and lifted up above any other false god. This God should be worshipped alone in the same way that God exalted David to be the highest king of all the nations. David says it's God who should be exalted. The God who executes vengeance for me. Subdues people under me. He delivers me from my enemies. Surely you lift me above those who rise up against me. You rescue me from the violent man. And I've told you often, David says, I will give thanks in the congregation. Look how he ends this psalm. Therefore I will give thanks to you among the nations, O Yahweh. Not just in Israel, but among all the nations of the world. I will lift you up and exalt you and give you thanks for what you've done. I will sing praises to your name. He gives great deliverance to his king and shows loving kindness to his anointed, to David and to his descendants forever. I just want to show you the verse one more time and we close. David says, no matter what God does, no matter whether the crooked are alive on earth, no matter whether he's fleeing in a cave from Saul, whether he's running for his life from his son Absalom, or whether he is exalted as the highest king above all the nations, in anything that David has ever found himself in any situation, David says God and his course of action is without guilt. If God has called it into our lives, then it is perfect. And I know that's hard for some of you that have a backache or lived with a several year long issue, fighting Parkinson's disease, trying to figure out whether your cancer is gone or not. All these different issues that we face. What King David would say to you is, God's course of action is perfect. If He's allowed it for a reason. And we should thank God for being our God and being in control of it all. He could change your situation as quickly and as easily as He changed David's. Let's close in prayer.